Well, welcome again to our service and sermon series, Uncovered. We've been walking through this during the season of Epiphany, being pointed to Jesus and pointing to God's astounding truths uncovered for us. Today we're looking at reactions uncovered, how you react when an enemy comes and does harm to you. For those of you who are actually listening to me, I got some tough things to say. Love your enemy. That means when you know somebody who harbors hate for you in their heart, you fight against them vehemently, tooth and nail. You don't hold a single thing back. You use the best weapon you have. You do good to them. For those of you who aren't daydreaming, for those of you who are listening to me, I got more tough things to say to you. Love your enemy. That means when your spouse abuses you, emotionally, verbally, and dare I say it, even physically, you fight back with everything you have, tooth and nail, as hard as you possibly can, with the best weapon you have. You pray for them. For those of you who haven't just written me off as a crazy man and rejected my message entirely and are still listening to me, I have some tough things to say to you. Love your enemy. That means when the pickpocket comes and pulls your wallet out of your back pocket, you turn around and you don't call the police, but you fight back with the best weapon you have. You give them your bank account with the PIN number 2, and you say, take it all. You still listening to me? If you are, maybe I got some tough words for you to hear. Love your enemy. And that means when the scary man comes up to you in the alleyway and he throws a left haymaker to your right cheek, you fight back with everything you have, tooth and nail, and you turn your face and you point out your right cheek. You put a bullseye right on it. For the guy who asks and asks and asks, you give and give and give. For the guy who takes and takes and takes, you don't demand anything back. Love your enemy. Is that hard to hear? It should be. Because I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if you can. Today I'm preaching on Luke 6, and it's a sermon from Jesus. So normally when I'm preaching a sermon, I try to find some sort of way to introduce it from an illustration out here from history, from my life, or from another area of the Bible. But when a preacher is preaching on a sermon from the master preacher, you got to introduce it the way he introduced it, don't you? And if you look at those words that Jesus said at the very beginning of the message, he said this, "But to those of you who are listening to me, love your enemies." Just those 3 words are what we're going to be focusing on today. Love your enemy. And I've got to unpack that for you in the way that Jesus does. What does it really truly mean to love? And then who are my enemies? Jesus does both of those things for us in Luke chapter 6. And then he gives us the motivation and the reason and the ability to love like that. One of the things about Jesus' sermon here on the plain in Luke chapter 6 is that we're just getting a snippet of a little portion of it right here today. And actually last week for the gospel reading, I read the first part of it, these beatitudes, these statements of blessings, and these statements of woes. And then we get to this section and Jesus starts the thing off and he says, "But to those of you who are listening to me." It seems interesting, right? Would you really think that there'd be people who would be listening to Jesus and wouldn't be listening and would stop listening to him altogether? People who would be sitting there and watching a man who preached with authority, a man who said things that nobody had ever said before, a man who did miracles and wonders to ratify the words that he spoke. It seems amazing and it seems astounding and astonishing that there would be anybody there that day who would not have been listening to Jesus. But you got to remember some of the things that Jesus said right before this. Jesus was talking about the relationship that people have with each other and their relationship with God. And just a few verses before what I read for the gospel reading today, Jesus told this to his listeners. He said, "Blessed are you when people hate you, when they exclude you and insult you and reject your name as evil because of the Son of Man." I'd imagine that there were some people there who were listening to Jesus at hearing these words, then said, I don't think that that's what I want. I bet there were some who were standing there listening to Jesus and thought, not for me. And their ears shut off. And if it wasn't at this part of the sermon, it might have been at this part of the sermon. Just a few verses later, Jesus spoke some woes, and he said, "Woe to you when everyone speaks well of you, for that is how their ancestors treated the false prophets." And I'd imagine that if there were those who were still listening to him at hearing this, they'd think, I don't want to be somebody who people speak poorly of. I kind of want to be people who everybody speaks well of. But then Jesus continued and he said, "But for those of you there who are left, for those of you who haven't drifted off and are in some other place in your mind, for those of you who haven't rejected my words altogether, to you who are still listening, I've got these words to say. Love your enemies." And Jesus had to be clear because he had just spoken some woes to people who were enemies to God and enemies to the Christian faith. Jesus spoke those woes, and he didn't want his listeners to go out and say, okay, if it's woe to them, then I better go and bring woe to those enemies. Jesus flipped it all on its head. He said, no, I want you to actually love those enemies. It's a really great illustration to think about this and to get this truth embedded in your head. There's a church called the Church of the Beatitudes in Israel, right on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. And some people think that this is the area right there where that church is, where Jesus was speaking some of the Beatitudes from Matthew chapter 5, this Sermon on the Mount. And what's interesting about this church is it's not really the church itself, but what's inside. What's interesting about this church is what's painted underneath on the inside portion of the dome, and it looks like this. As worshipers go into the Church of the Beatitudes, this is what they see. Do you know what they're looking at? They're looking at the sky. You notice something that's kind of weird and off about it? The colors are flopped. And it's not because the person who painted it was colorblind. It's not because the person who painted ordered the wrong quantities of yellow and blue paint. But they wanted to switch it up so that when worshipers walked into the Church of the Beatitudes, no matter what the guy was preaching that day, they could gaze up at the sky painted underneath that dome and notice that it was completely backwards. And remember the words that Jesus spoke that to our sinful ears and to our sinful nature are completely backwards. Love your enemies? When Jesus spoke that and preached that time, this would have been a completely upside down way of thinking for the people who had come out of a Greek way of thinking. 400 years before Jesus was walked the face of the earth, a Greek philosopher by the name of Plato did. And even 100 years before that, 500 years before Jesus was born, a Greek philosopher by the name of Sophocles did. And both of them wrote comments on a Greek notion that had been out there for years before they wrote. They wrote something like this, or wrote about this, which nobody knows really who came up with this phrase. But both Plato and Sophocles talked about it. I considered it established that one should do harm to one's enemies and be of service to one's friends. This was the general notion of the day. And I would argue that it doesn't really matter who wrote this, because this is kind of what's ingrained in every single one of us, right? It makes a lot of sense. If somebody is out to get me, I don't really want to do good to them. If somebody is out there to harm me, I don't really want to love them in action and in words. If someone is out there to steal from me, I don't want to be there and to pray for them. I'd actually maybe do what the author unknown said and say, well, it's up to me to harm my enemy, but only help my friend. And Jesus looks and says, to those of you who are still listening, I'm going to flip it upside down. I'm going to turn the sky yellow and the sun blue. I'm going to say the exact opposite, but this is how Christians live. Love your enemy. So what is love? You've probably heard it at a wedding. Maybe you said it, or you heard it said, or you felt it. You were there and you thought, love is in the air. Maybe at your wedding, you think back to that great day, and you think about that, your spouse walking down the aisle, or you seeing her, and love is in the air. It's a feeling that you can almost cut with a knife on that day, right? Love is in the air. I remember my wedding. It was a wonderful day. I wish all of you could have been there. Thankfully, one person was, so that's great. And I remember at my wedding feeling that love was in the air. But I also remember sitting in a seat kind of like you are, and watching a man and listening to him who was standing kind of like where I am. And he preached on a text that really taught me what love is. It's a kind of a cool coincidence that the text that was preached on at my wedding is the second reading for today from Romans chapter 12. Paul was talking to a whole bunch of people as Christians, and he was saying, this is how you love. And one of the interesting comments that the preacher made on that day, he made a little bit of a joke. He said, Paul and Allison, this text that I'm preaching on today, did you know that it's not really for married couples? It's for enemies. And he said, it's almost like the two of you are planning on having some struggles in your marriage. And there were a few chuckles out there, and once that all kind of subsided, he said, and if that's what you're planning, you'd be right. But he says, this is how the Apostle Paul talks about what love is. It's an action that does these things, even when the one closest to you, whom you love, becomes your enemy. He says, the Apostle Paul says this laundry list of things: bless those who persecute you, live in harmony with one another, do not be proud, do not repay anyone evil for evil, do not take revenge. If your enemy is hungry, feed him. If he is thirsty, give him something to drink. The Apostle Paul reiterates what Jesus already said in the gospel reading for today. Love is an action. Because when love that's in the air of that wedding day fades, real love can't. When those butterflies go away and that fuzzy feeling isn't there that day, real love can't go away with it. So that's what love is. But who's my enemy? It's probably way, way, way too easy and kind of a cop-out to just say, okay, I think my enemy is like a government or a country out there that's doing a few unchristian things. It's definitely a little bit too easy and definitely a cop-out to say, it's a government, maybe national or state or even local, or doing a few things that I don't agree with, and so that's what Jesus means when he's talking about an enemy. It's way too easy to just pick on these things that are far away, where they're close enough where I can care about them, but too far enough away for me to really do anything about them, to call those the enemies that are close to me. Because there's one little word in Jesus' phrase, love your enemies, that we got to jump into, that little word, your. It's personal. It's a pronoun. One way to think about this is enemy, a true enemy, is probably an enemy who actually knows your name, who knows who you are. I read from Genesis chapter 45, and we got to remember this account of Joseph and his brothers, the ones who at one point were so close to him, knew his name, but became his enemy, sold him into slavery, wanted to kill him, lied about what they did, and went back to their father and covered it up with a bloody coat. When somebody like that, close to you, who knows your name, becomes your enemy, how do you react? When your spouse is berating you, what do? When a friend whom you know is gossiping behind your back, how do you think about her? When your coworker betrays you, what do you do to him? It's at this point where you hear that phrase again, love your enemy, and you know it's a tough one. And you think, man, I don't know if I can do it. There was a father who preached a sermon much like the one that Jesus was preaching to the people in and around the Sea of Galilee a bunch of years ago, and I think it went something like this. The father was preaching to his son, and I'm pretty sure he said something like this: "Son, I've got some bad news for you. You've got a lot of enemies out there." He was preaching a sermon, and I think it went something like this: "Son, I've got bad news for you. They live in and around Niles, Illinois. Son, I've got some bad news for you. They're going to be worshiping on February 20th, 2022, and that church, St. Matthew's Lutheran Church, it's going to be full of people who have acted like your enemy through their action and their thought and their word." And the father was preaching to his son, and he said, "Son, I've got some bad news for you. You're going to go, and they're going to take, and they won't give back. You're going to go, and they're going to lend, and don't expect it to earn any interest. And son, you're going to go, and they're going to hit you in the face and over the head and pierce your hands and pierce your feet, and don't expect them to look at you a second time. And son, you're going to go, and you're going to die." The father preached a sermon like that to a son, and your Savior said, "Lord, your will be done." A father preached a sermon like that to a son, and your Savior said, "This big laundry list of items and things that I have got to do, I'll do them. And even if they're ungrateful, and even if they're wicked, and even if they don't deserve mercy, they're going to be children of the Most High God because He is kind to the ungrateful. He is kind to the wicked. And so be merciful, but don't just be merciful just as your Father is merciful." As you hear the words that are tough to hear from Luke chapter 6, do not separate them from the one who's saying them. Do not separate them from the one who lived them. Do not separate them from Christ, who was the one who loved you and me when we were His enemy. And even now, when I act like His enemy through the sin that I have done, He loves me as an ungrateful one. He's merciful to me just as the Father is. In this whole laundry list of things that Jesus says, here is how to love your enemy. Oh, man. The only way that we are able to do any of that is to realize how much He's loved me. To remember how much He's forgiven you, even though you don't deserve it. And then when you look at that big, long list of ways to love your enemy, maybe your question is, well, where do I start? And if I can give you just a little bit of advice, I think you start at the second half of verse 28, where Jesus said this: pray. Pray for those who mistreat you. What would happen if instead of fighting vehement words with vehement words, you took it to God in prayer. And you prayed something like this: Lord, I don't deserve anything, and I thank you for being merciful and forgiving me. Forgive her. When something happens to you, an action that you just don't like, and you want to go and get revenge, what if instead you prayed something like this: Dear Lord, I'm going to leave the revenge and the avenging up to you, because the way that you dealt with me is that you forgave me. So actually, forgive him. Your Lord has been merciful to you, even though you and I don't deserve it. And when an enemy who knows your name wrongs you, pray and love. This is how Christians react. Love your enemies. Amen. Please stand. We'll continue by confessing our faith using the words of the Creed. We believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty,